Today's case is going to be an extremely upsetting one because we are discussing the murder of Szita Bence, an 11-year-old child. So if this is too upsetting for you, then I recommend you don't watch this video. But I'm also going to put in timestamps in case you want to skip over some of the parts, which I totally understand. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel where I talk about Hungarian true crime cases, and my name is Tímea. And today I decided to cover a more recent case because I usually talk about communist crimes and mysteries from the last century, but today I wanted to tell you about a murder that I remember being on the news when I was in high school. It was a huge case. Everybody in the media was talking about it, and I just thought I wanted to share with you to bring maybe a little bit of justice to this poor boy and his family. So let's get started with it. Szita Bence was only 11 years old. He was a wonderful, beautiful, innocent little boy who liked all the things that a boy likes. He had lots of friends, he was a good student, everybody in his school and in his family loved him and could only say good things about him. His entire life was ahead of him, and his mom used to call him Manocska, which kind of means little elf, though Mano in Hungarian could translate to anything from elf to dwarf to sprite, anything that's a small humanoid figure, but it's a cute word. It's a very cute name to call someone Manocska. He was loving and he was loved. And his family relations are a little bit complicated, but let me explain. So his biological father didn't want anything to do with him when he learned that Sylvia, Bence's mother, was pregnant with him. So he was out of the picture from the beginning. But then Sylvia met and fell in love with a man named Gyöngyi Sándor, who was, even though only the stepfather to Bence, he was his father figure. He looked at him like his real dad, and Sylvia and Sándor raised Bence happily together. Though with time, Sándor and Sylvia's relationship ended, but they stayed on good terms. And because Sylvia wasn't financially stable enough, she wasn't able to support herself and her son, Bence ended up living with Sándor, his father, and with his other daughter from a previous relationship called Gyöngyi Lila. And it was a happy family, everything was fine, up until Sándor got together with a woman called Polc Erika. They not only got into a relationship, but they also moved in together, and Erika also had another son who was the same age as Bence. But the two boys really didn't get along. They were not good friends. So with time, Sándor proposed that they should move back out, like how they used to be before, for the happiness of the children. And they first wanted to continue their relationship, Sándor and Erika, but eventually they ended up breaking up, and this made Erika very upset and devastated. So to summarize the family dynamics, we don't know his biological father, so he used to live with his biological mom Sylvia and his stepfather Sándor, but then they broke up, and then Sándor got together with Erika, but then they also broke up. Despite all of these breakups and moving in and out, the family was still a happy and healthy one, or so it seemed, and even Erika had a good relationship with the children of Sándor, even after they broke up. So this is how it happened that one day Erika texted little Bence on his phone, asking him to come visit him from his town in her city called Kaposvár. Even though Bence was only 11 years old, he already had his own cell phone, so he could text with people, and he was also allowed to ride the bus by himself. He was an independent little boy, so it was no big deal for him to take this short bus ride from his town to this other city and spend a few days with his previous stepmom. And he was actually excited to do that because his stepsister, Lila, who he loved a lot, was also going to be there. So Bence got on the bus and he went to his stepmom on the 29th of October 2012. But tragically, that same day he got there, he was reported missing by Erika. Now, according to Erika, what happened is that they went to do some grocery shopping in the nearby Tesco, and while she was shopping inside the supermarket, Bence was allowed to play outside at the playground in the parking lot of the supermarket. He was unsupervised, he was old enough, and he was independent enough, so it wasn't a big deal for him to spend an hour or so playing with the other children. But when Erika was finished shopping and she came outside, she saw that Bence was nowhere to be seen. This happened at around 7 p.m., but for some reason he wasn't reported as missing until about midnight. And when the police was informed about his disappearance, they immediately formed a search party. And it was a huge one. They used search dogs, civilians volunteered, the Hunter Committee helped them search through the wooded areas and the forests around the town. But for the first few days, nothing really came up. It wasn't until 5 days later, so on the 3rd of November, that they finally found him. But they didn't find him alive. What actually happened is that the police first found the murder scene. In a secluded wooded area, they found a pit dug in the ground, as well as traces of blood and some pieces of fabric, but not his body. A little further away, in a different part of this foresty area, they found the scene where he was actually buried. There, in a shallow grave, they found his body, as well as a knife and a shovel. And crazily enough, that same day the police announced that they actually already have 3 suspects, a woman and 2 men. But at first we didn't know who the suspects could have been, though a few days later the police confirmed that the woman was none other than Erika. And weirdly enough, every time she was asked about the disappearance and now murder of Bence, Erika always said that, "Oh, I'm so sorry for him. I don't know what happened to him, but whatever happened, I had nothing to do with it. I love that boy like I love my own son." And as you may already know from my previous videos, in Hungary the norm is that the investigations are very secretive. Like, the police didn't share pretty much anything about what they knew. And it wasn't until over 6 months later that they finally let on some of the details. But for now, this is all we know, that he was murdered and there were 3 suspects. When it was confirmed that Bence was no longer alive, the locals all went to the playground in the parking lot of the Tesco where he was allegedly last seen, and they lit thousands of candles in his memory. His burial was held on the 10th of November, and over 2,500 people came from all over the country to pay their respect. His whole school and his whole family and the whole city of Kaposvár was there. And as I mentioned, the police didn't let on any of the information that they found out during the investigation until about 6 months later. And what I'm about to tell you is really upsetting, and when I was researching this case, I was just raging. I was so sad. This is going to be so unjust. Remember when I was telling you about his family dynamics? Well, not everybody in that family was a good person. You see, Erika was more like a classic, evil, jealous stepmother. She really started to resent Bence when her relationship with Sándor, Bence's father, ended, because she thought that Bence was the whole reason why the relationship ended, that he was in her way to a happy, healthy relationship. And she also hated the little boy for not making friends with her own son. So things were just turning really bad. She thought that if Bence wasn't in the picture anymore, then she could get back together with Sándor and they could happily raise her son together in peace. And this is when she came up with the evil plan to kill Bence. The first time Erika attempted to kill Bence was when she laced some energy drink with rat poison and gave it to the boy, trying to convince him to drink it. But he didn't. And then Erika had to come up with another plan of killing this little boy. She hired 2 hitmen in the form of 2 homeless men, namely Bodnár József and Kertész József, so they had the same given name. Now, how she knew these 2 men is kinda unclear, but it's redundant anyway. This story is not about them. But long story short, Erika claimed that when she came up with the plan of murdering an innocent 11-year-old boy, she just went out to the street, headed to the first pub that she could find, and she asked the very first homeless man to be her accomplice in exchange for about 200,000 forints. And crazily enough, she succeeded because the first homeless person she came across agreed to the murder. And this man was already a criminal. He had already served 20 years in prison for other offenses. And then he went on to introduce his friend to become the other accomplice. And that guy was rumored to be an abusive husband and father to his family, though I cannot confirm if that's true. That's more just like a hearsay than a fact. That was when she decided to invite him to visit her in the city and spend a fun weekend together. But instead of that same day that he got there, she coaxed her into her car and drove him out to this secluded wooded area where the 2 homeless men were already waiting for them. And this is your warning, skip to this part if you don't want to hear the details. There they dragged the little helpless boy out of the car, and one of the men hit him in the head with the shovel, knocking him unconscious. Then, while one of the other men was digging the pit in the ground, the first man stabbed him about 40 times with a knife. And during this whole time, Erika was there, watching her stepson getting murdered while holding a flashlight. Insanely, this little boy was so strong and had such a strong will to live that he was still alive. Even 40 stabs weren't enough to kill him just yet. And they could have saved his life had these monsters decided to just change their mind and take him to the hospital. He would be still alive today. But they didn't, and they threw the little boy into the pit and started burying him alive. His cause of death was suffocation from inhaling soil. While burying the body, the trio was actually interrupted by 2 hunters who just happened to walk by. And when the 2 hunters asked them what they were doing, they just came up with some awkward small talk that deterred them, and allegedly they even said that they were there having an orgy. But either way, the hunters just decided to leave and they didn't think much out of it at first. But now the 3 murderers were freaked out and they thought it would be better to relocate the body somewhere else. So they dug out the now dead body of Bence and they drove to another, even further location in the forest where they dug another pit in the ground and buried him there. A few days later, one of the men decided to come forward because he said that his consciousness was just eating him alive. And that was when he confessed to everything that happened. Ironically, all 3 perpetrators, even after the guilty confession, thought that they could save their ass and plead not guilty. they came up with all kinds of stupid reasons as to why they were innocent and how they were all just dragged into this ordeal. The first man, who was the same that went to the police in the first place, said that he was tricked and coaxed into this whole thing with the promise that he was going to go to the forest to have sex, and that he had no idea that the other two were planning on murder. He said that his only part in this whole thing was digging the pit in the ground, and he otherwise never saw Erika and never knew Bence in person before. The other man said that the reason why he couldn't have killed the little boy was because he loved kids. And his proof for that was that every time he visited a family who had children, he always brought them gifts and candy. And that is supposed to be an obvious proof for you to believe that he's not a murderer. And then Erika had the audacity to deny her part in the murders too. She said that the other two men wanted to kill a little boy, so they forced her to kidnap him and then beat her and locked her in the car while the other two were murdering Bence. Like, she had the audacity to deny that she was the one who orchestrated it, planned it on 2 separate occasions, hired 2 hitmen, sold her jewelry to be able to pay them, and then stood there with a flashlight watching while she was probably thinking about how she was going to get back together with Sándor and have a happy marriage. Their trial started in 2013 and lasted about 7 months, and in the end all 3 of them were given life in prison without the possibility of parole. Being child murderers, they were the lowest of the low in prison. They were constantly attacked and they had to be kept separate from the others, and they were even moved around in different prisons for their own safety. But they deserved all of this. By now, all of the murderers have died. Erika died in January of 2017 after a long battle with breast cancer. Bogdan József died in June of 2019 of lung cancer, and finally Kertész József died in September of 2019 of an undisclosed disease. Sándor, Bence's father, always wanted to outlive those monsters, and that wish was granted, but not for so long, because in November of 2020, so just a year ago, he died of a long-standing disease. Some people say that he grew sick of all the grief and sorrow that he had to endure. And Sylvia, Bence's mother, is still alive, but according to the last interview that she gave, things aren't going that well for her. She had a hard time finding a job, and as much as I know, her last workplace was at a chicken farm, and somebody was helping her rent out an office space, so it wasn't even a real apartment. The office didn't have a proper kitchen or a bathroom, but at least she had a roof over her head. I'm just very sad that her life was ruined. Sándor's life was ruined. The whole family was torn apart. And for what? This woman got an innocent child murdered for what? She didn't even get what she wanted out of this. She really thought that her relationship with Sándor was going to be fine if Bence was out of the picture. Like, I'm not sure how to describe what I'm feeling about this. And to me, it is baffling that she wasn't the only insane and evil person in this story. That all she had to do was go to the street and ask the first homeless person that she could find. And she found not one but 2 accomplices who were happy to help her for almost no money. And in the end, they got nothing out of this. They got life in prison and they all died of cancer. This was so senseless. This was so unfair, so unjust, so cruel and evil, and none of this none of this had to happen. That is the end of this case, and I don't know what we can take away from this. I don't know how to make any light of this situation. I don't think it's possible. By far, this is one of the, or if probably the most depressive cases that I ever researched. And thank you very much for listening to the terrible story of Bence and his family. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next week. Bye.